Hello everyone and welcome back to another election prediction video. In today's video, we are going to be taking a look at the 2026 United States Senate elections. So what I have right here is the 2026 Senate election map. So I'm going to fill it in with the incumbents with the respective parties. So Florida and Ohio have Republican incumbents, but these are special elections. The election in Ohio, Senator John Husted is running for re-election. He was appointed to replace J.D. Vance, who resigned his Senate seat when he assumed the role of the vice presidency, and that seat is up for its regular election in 2028. Additionally, in Florida, Ashley Moody is running for re-election. She was appointed when Marco Rubio resigned his Senate seat to accept the nomination and confirmation to become Secretary of State. And that Senate seat is also up for regular election in 2028. And then the rest of the Senate seats I will fill in with the incumbent parties and go from there. So currently, the makeup of the United States Senate is 53 Republicans and 47 Democrats. Well, 45 Democrats and 2 independents. Or, yes, 45 Democrats and 2 independents, Bernie Sanders of Vermont and Angus King of Maine. And now I'm going to highlight the retiring senators in 2026. And in 2026, retiring senators include Joni Ernst in Iowa. They also include Tom Tillis in North Carolina. Also included are Democrats Gary Peters in Michigan and Tina Smith in Minnesota and Dick Durbin in Illinois. Additionally, retiring are Mitch McConnell in Kentucky, and I can actually pull this up with the 2026 United States Senate election. And then also Tommy Tuberville is retiring in the state of Alabama. So 53 Democrats, 47 Republicans, only notable retirement. And then I believe Jean Shaheen is retiring in New Hampshire. She is. Okay, so those are the retirements. So already looking like a pretty tough political situation for the Democrats to gain seats back and options. I'm going to see if there's a way to clear the map, if there is. So I'm just going to clear the map now. So we're going to talk about safe states first. And those safe states are Oklahoma. Well, we'll talk about safe states in high likely states. So a state like Kansas, the Democrats usually field like a decent nominee, and the Republicans generally will win it by under 15 points, which is the technical margin for a safe margin of victory. But I honestly believe that it's not going to be competitive. So Montana is the same way. So all these safe states for the Republicans. Same with South Carolina. Democrats got close for South Carolina standards in 2020, but chances are they won't field a nominee strong enough to flip the state. And then Oregon, Minnesota's leaning towards, well, okay, Colorado is a good example of a high likely state for the Democrats, as is New Mexico. Not going to be competitive, but going to be under 15 points. Illinois probably going to be safe. New Jersey safe. Cory Booker is up for re-election there. Delaware, Rhode Island, Massachusetts all safe, as well as Virginia is going to be a high likely margin with Senator John Warner. So that leaves us with 12 seats in somewhat in play, and there's a few we can classify as likely right away. Like Alaska's likely, has the potential to be competitive, but probably will not be. Iowa likely right away. We're not going to take a close look at these yet. This is a general overview. We will do deep dives on these. Florida is likely, not going to take a close look yet. Texas is likely, not going to take a close look yet. Minnesota is likely not going to take a close look yet. Nebraska is likely. Senator Dan Osborne, Dan Osborne is running against Senator Pete Ricketts. Ricketts is much better funded than Deb Fischer was in 2024. But realistically, it's going to come down to 6 states. And as you can see, Republicans are already at 50 seats here. So chances are, well, at this rate, Republicans are very likely retaining their Senate majority. And the big thing with that is they have the tie-breaking vote with J.D. Vance. So we can already say with very high confidence that Republicans are probably going to retain the Senate majority. You look, Nebraska could get competitive. If you look down at Nebraska here, and you can see based on the color of some of these that I've already looked into some of these races. So if you look at polling for the general election, you do have Dan Osborne leading in a poll, 900 likely voters, margin of error 3.3%. It's a Democratic Commission poll, and there was another one slightly earlier. But Dan Osborne still polling around 47%. And if you go back to 2024, the 2024 election in the state of Nebraska, the regular election, Dan Osborne did get around 47% of the vote. So that could drop down to a lean margin, but then you look at 2020, Ben Sasse was elected with the margin of victory of 38 points. So not a Senate election we'll be taking a super close look at yet. So now moving on to the state of Ohio. And so first of all, I want to clarify something else, is tilt margins. So tilt margins are under 1 point of victory. And the big thing about tilt margins is they are incredibly rare. So this is map.jacksonjude.com. So this is an archive of all previous elections. And if you click on it, it will actually take you to the election, the Wikipedia page for the election. So what was I talking about? I was talking about tilt races. So you look, you had 3 tilt Senate races in 2024, and that's incredibly rare. I had always said I don't like to categorize races as tilt simply because having a tilt margin is so rare that it's difficult to categorize. So you go back to 2022, you had 1 Senate race. You go back to 2020, no Senate races were tilt margins. 2018, you had 1. 2016, you had 1. 2014, you had 1. 2012, you had 1. 2010, you had none. 2008, you had 1. And 2006, you had 2. So looking at this, it's extremely difficult to categorize something as a tilt margin of victory. So just going into these 6 states that are going to be extremely competitive, I just want you to keep that in mind. Kind of the weight I keep on categorizing something as a tilt margin of victory. So let's go back to the 2026 United States Senate elections. The overall 2026 United States Senate elections. And let's talk about the state of New Hampshire. Incumbent Senator Jeanne Shaheen is retiring. Jared Sullivan, I wonder if he's related to Jake Sullivan. He does not appear to be. Jake Sullivan is married to a congressperson from New Hampshire, Maggie Goodlander, so I was curious if Jared Sullivan was a relative, but he does not appear to be. Chris Pappas is the U.S. representative for New Hampshire's 1st congressional district. He first won his seat in 2018. He is, I would say, far and away the frontrunner, polling at above 60% or close to 60%, even with 30% undecided. So in the Republican primary, John Sununu is declared, as well as Scott Brown. Scott Brown was the nominee for this seat in 2014, and if you look back to see how he did, he got within 3.2 points of flipping the seat. Additionally, if you go back to 2002, when this seat was last in Republican hands, John Sununu actually beat Jeanne Shaheen by 4.5 points, only to lose the seat by 6 points in 2008. So looking at Republican polling, John Sununu is polling at around 40% with 30% undecided. And there was a noticeable shift from when he wasn't in the race of support shifting from Scott Brown to him. So I think it's pretty safe to say that he is likely to be the nominee. Scott Brown could still win, but I could also see Scott Brown withdrawing and endorsing him. If you look at this long list of endorsements that he probably has 75% of the Republican Senate caucus endorsing him already, and no senators endorsing Scott Brown. So then tilt D, lean D, lean D, tilt D. So Scott Brown, the only polling polling has been done against Sununu and Brown, Pappas versus Sununu and Pappas versus Brown. The polling versus Scott Brown, Pappas plus 11.0, approaching 50%, but that's still with 14% undecided. And New Hampshire is a swingy state when it comes to the governor's races and the Senate races, although it's somewhat reliably Democratic on the presidential level, less so on the statewide level. So you look at the polling versus John Sununu, and there's a noticeable difference. Pappas only leads by 4. So the way I'd categorize this, and there's a noticeable shift in support. So, for example, the University of New Hampshire poll showed Pappas at 32 and Scott Brown at 37. Showed Pappas at 52 and Scott Brown at 37, and it showed Pappas at 49 and Sununu at 43. So a noticeable break in undecided voters, as well as some Democrats either going to undecided or to Sununu's camp. So right now, I would categorize New Hampshire as leans Democratic. I think Pappas will probably win by around 4 points. I think it'll be more competitive than expected, given the national environment is expected to favor Democrats. But once again, New Hampshire has shown that it's not necessarily affected by the national environment. Incumbency, name recognition, and delivering results are key to voters in New Hampshire. So that's why Jeanne Shaheen was always reelected by very good margins. You look at 2014, still won by 3 points, whereas states like Virginia, which were swing states at the time, Mark Warner only won by under a point. Colorado flipped back to the Republican Party. You've got to remember Colorado, Virginia, and New Hampshire were all swing states back in 2014. And then you look at 2020, and Jeanne Shaheen wins by 15 points, whereas Joe Biden only carried the state by 7 points. And then moving on now to the state of, let's do Ohio. Let's talk about Ohio. So the state of Ohio is a special election. Incumbent senator is Republican John Husted. And this is the seat where J.D. Vance defeated Tim Ryan by around 6.5 points in 2022. J.D. Vance is obviously now the vice president of the United States. And John Husted was appointed by Governor Mike DeWine when J.D. Vance resigned his seat to be sworn in as vice president. And John Husted is, I believe, far and away the favorite to win the nomination. 2 people filed paperwork, but that doesn't even necessarily mean they will end up on the ballot. And one thing I want to talk about here is the International Union of Operating Engineers Locals 18 and 66, as well as the Northwest Ohio Building and Construction Trades Council, have endorsed Senator Husted. And the reasoning why that is important is because the favorite to win the Democratic nomination is Sherrod Brown. While he has received some union endorsements, all of these, the IUOE endorsements as well as the Northwest Ohio Building and Construction Trades Council, are endorsements that Sherrod Brown had received previously. However, those organizations have now flipped to endorsing Husted. And Sherrod Brown lost against Bernie Moreno by around 4 points in 2024. And he's attempting a comeback Senate bid. And when you look at cash on hand and money raised, both candidates have about the same amount of money, which, if you look back to 2022 when J.D. Vance was running against Tim Ryan was noticeably underfunded. So it does appear that Democrats are going to at least make an attempt to flip this Senate seat into their column. And it's not back into their column because the Senate seat they lost is not up again until 2030. So it's lean Republican right now. Polling shows Husted at around a point to a point and a half up. Some polls have showed Sherrod Brown leading, but once again, a registered voter poll, which tends to skew in the Democratic Party's favor. Additionally, if you look at the timing of some of these polls, there was a time when Sherrod Brown was leading, but then it has shifted back to favoring John Husted. And Tim Ryan does appear to be the better nominee in this case. Or I'm sorry, Sherrod Brown does appear to be the better nominee in this case, as opposed to Tim Ryan if you look at the polling. Husted +3 and Husted +6 versus Husted +7, +6. And you look back to 2024, Sherrod Brown lost by about 3.5 points here. But when you look at the map, Northwest Ohio is out here. Or was it Northeast Ohio that endorsed Husted? Northwest Ohio. So Northwest Ohio is Toledo. So if it was Northeast Ohio, that's a bit more of a problem for Brown because if you look at the swing from 2018 to 2024, that's the area where he lost the most support. So fortunately for him, it was Northwest Ohio, which he lost support, but noticeably less than in Northeast Ohio. But then again, there's something to be said about how much endorsements matter, if at all. So right now, I think it's logical to place Ohio as leans Republican because the polling is actually very similar to the polling discrepancy between Brown and Moreno in 2024, when Brown ended up losing by around 3.5 points, as opposed to the polling where he was only shown to be losing by 1 point. So I think it's safe to say there'll be a similar margin in 2026. Husted is also more of a Mike DeWine style Republican, and Rob Portman, who vacated the seat in 2022. So less of a controversial nominee than someone like Vivek Ramaswamy would have been. So I believe that that will make up for any gains that Brown would make based on the national environment. And now moving on to the state of Michigan. And the state of Michigan, incumbent Democrat Gary Peters is retiring. He was first elected in 2014 by a margin of 13 points and was reelected in 2020 by 1.7 percentage points with under 50% of the vote. So he is opting to retire in 26, probably saw the margin in 24 and realized it would be somewhat of a tough re-election fight. And looking at the Democratic primary and the Republican primary. In the Republican primary, Mike Rogers is, I would say, pretty much the favorite to win the nomination. He has the most cash on hand, the most money raised far and away. Additionally, he has the endorsement of Donald Trump, which, as we've seen in Republican primaries, is very important to winning. Additionally, John Thune has endorsed him, and I believe he's probably backed by the National Republican Senatorial Campaign Committee. And then if you look at hypothetical polling, yeah, he's far and away a favorite to win the nomination. He's beating everyone else in the poll, and the people in the poll aren't even running. So then you look at the Democratic primary, the three major nominees are Abdul El Sayed, Mallory McMorrow, and Haley Stevens. And Mallory McMorrow is running from a somewhat progressive standpoint. Abdul El Sayed is running from a very progressive standpoint. And Haley Stevens is running from a more moderate standpoint. And you look, each of them have gotten their own endorsements here. And then if you look at the polling, as far as cash on hand, Haley Stevens does have a little bit more cash on hand, but Mallory McMurrow has also raised significant money, as well as Abdullah Saeed. And Haley Stevens is polling ahead of others, but not by much. She's not very far ahead of McMurrow, who's not very far ahead of El Said, and 33% of voters are still undecided. And then there's just polling here that shows that Gretchen Whitmer would far and away be the nominee if she ran, but she's not going to run. And then scrolling down to the general election, the polling has been done for Mike Rogers versus all three Democratic candidates. Mike Rogers polls significantly ahead of Abdul El Said in every poll, polls significantly ahead of McMurrow in almost every poll, although two show McMurrow leading. And then Haley Stevens and Mike Rogers are kind of polling even with each other, all things considered. So right now, given that Haley Stevens is the frontrunner for the Democratic nomination, given the national environment, Michigan's tendency to vote for Democrats at a wider margin down ballot, like if you look at all these polls, just like Haley Stevens isn't polling above 30% in the Democratic primary. Additionally, Mike Rogers isn't polling above 48% in any of these polls. So there's still that fact to be considered. I would say that Michigan leans Democratic at this point, just given the national environment and the way things end up shaking out with the way undecided voters decide to split one way or another. And now let's take a look at the Senate election in the state of North Carolina. So we are back to Michigan, and now we're going to take a look at North Carolina. So North Carolina incumbent Republican Senator Thom Tillis is retiring. North Carolina is a purple state, although it tends to favor Republicans. It voted for Donald Trump in all three elections and has not had a Democratic senator since 2008. That was Kay Hagan. She was in office until 2014. And she was actually defeated by Thom Tillis in 2014. And then, however, on the state level, it does tend to vote for Democrats. North Carolina has had a Democratic governor for much of the last 30 years. And in the Democratic primary, former Governor Roy Cooper is far and away the frontrunner. 10 million raised, 8 million cash on hand. You look at the Republican primary, it's a little bit more crowded, but Michael Whatley, is the, I'm going to see how to pronounce his name. Does not say how to pronounce his name. Michael Whatley, we'll go with that for now. If I'm wrong, please correct me in the comments. Appears to be the frontrunner. I mean, significantly more cash on hand than anyone else, and he's only one of two to file. He has the endorsement of Donald Trump and John Thune, so that's pretty much a lock on the primary there. Hypothetical polling was just if Tillis decided to run. So then you go down to the general election, ranked as a toss-up. Once again, Roy Cooper polling at around 48% against Don Brown, but against Michael Whatley, that drops down to 46.7, 46, just consistently 46, 47, 48 plus. But you look at the margins, and those are somewhat significant margins. Michael Whatley is not above 42 in any of these polls. So you have above 10% undecided. In a state like North Carolina, a significant amount of those are going to break for the Republican nominee. I'm going to bet that Roy Cooper probably wins with just over 50% of the vote. And the reason I'm saying that is because the national environment in 2026 is going to favor the Democratic Party. Even though a lot of those undecideds will break for Whatley, 2/3 of them can do that. 66% can do that. And Roy Cooper still gets above 50%. So even though he's not polling above 47%, and the other thing is there is a libertarian nominee as well. So that could serve as a spoiler for the Republicans. I'm willing to bet that the libertarian nominee gets around 2% of the vote. Michael Whatley gets around about 48%, and Roy Cooper gets about 50%, winning the Senate seat. And that's going to be a flip for the Democratic Party. Moving on to Georgia. And I'm saving Maine for last, just for the sole reason that that is probably the most interesting one to talk about. But moving on to Georgia. Incumbent Senator Jon Ossoff, first elected in 2020, is running for re-election. And the Republicans' dream nominee, their desired nominee, was Brian Kemp. However, he did decline to run. Brian Kemp is the incumbent governor of Georgia. And I had always said I didn't think Brian Kemp was going to run, because if you look at Brian Kemp's political ambitions, Georgia is a swing state now. He was elected narrowly in 2018. He was reelected in 2022 by 8 points, 2 years after Joe Biden won the state at the presidential level. So he was reelected by a pretty wide margin, 8 points in a swing state. So he obviously has national ambitions, which I believe he's going to run for president in 2028, or at least angle to be someone's vice president in 2028. And additionally, when you talk about Georgia's one of the larger states in the country, when you talk about going from being the governor of a state as large as Georgia to going to becoming a U.S. senator where you're one of 100. So from an executive to a legislative role, that's something a lot of politicians don't want to do. Brian Kemp being one of those. So I had always doubted that he was going to run for the Senate seat. However, the Republican primary field is decently crowded. Buddy Carter, Mike Collins, both U.S. congressmen are running, as well as Derek Dooley, who is the former football coach of the Tennessee Volunteers. It's University of Tennessee, Knoxville. And Brian Kemp has actually endorsed Dooley as... Oh, Donald Trump has not issued an endorsement yet. That's interesting. So Derek Dooley actually has the least amount of cash on hand out of all the major candidates. Buddy Carter has the most, followed by Mike Collins. And in a three-way primary, you have close to 50%, significantly above 40%, 40 to like 45% undecided, but Mike Collins is leading by around 10 points against Buddy Carter, who's leading by an additional 5 against Derek Dooley. So that's very interesting. If I had to bet on it, I would wager that Collins is the nominee. Just like a plurality win, probably. But then again, I think it might go to a runoff if no one wins a majority. It should say here. I don't know. But if it goes to a runoff, that could be interesting, seeing who the candidate who places third endorses, if they issue an endorsement at all. Jon Ossoff, far and away the Democratic nominee, and then going down to polling here. Once again, similar situation to North Carolina, but much closer. Ossoff plus 3.6. Michael Whatley in North Carolina was polling at around 40, Roy Cooper at 46, Buddy Carter's polling at around 40 with Ossoff at 43. Personally, the way I see Georgia as a swing state is I see Georgia as a little bit more of a swing state than North Carolina. I think Ossoff wins by around 3 to 4. He's generally approved of in Georgia. And I mean, if you look at the hypothetical polling, Brian Kemp led him in every poll, but if you look against Derek Dooley, he's up by significantly more. Mike Collins. Or, I'm sorry, he's this is against Buddy Carter against Mike Collins, who is currently the front runner. And I just want to double check on that. Yes, Collins is currently the front runner. Go down to polling against Collins. It's a similar situation with Signal, which is a Republican poll. I generally tend to like Signal's polls. I think as far as statewide races go, they're relatively credible. They tend to do a larger sample size of likely voters, and their margins of error are generally under 4%, which is pretty good. But polling pretty much shows Ossoff up by close to 4%. Or sorry, against Mike Collins, um, close to 2.5%. Trafalgar is another good poll I like to use. See, the thing with Trafalgar is Trafalgar leans Republican with polling, but if you look at a Trafalgar poll with that in mind, they're generally pretty, I don't know if accurate is the word, because they generally do have a little bit of Republican bias. But the thing with that is if you consider that okay, this is biased by a point to a point and a half towards the Republican candidate, generally, if you take that into account, it's a pretty accurate poll if you take that calculation into account. Like, you look at this under a 3% margin of error, and you look at their sample size, and sample size is directly related to margin of error, but 1,426 likely voters. And the key is likely voters are more likely to vote than registered voters. Right now, pretty much, I'm putting Georgia in leans Democratic just because as far as like the polling goes, it's close, but with the way the midterms are shaping up to favor the Democratic Party, and generally Senate elections heavily favor incumbents, I will put Georgia as leans Democratic. And then lastly, the state of Maine. Incumbent Senator Susan Collins, one of the few Republicans still as a senator in a blue state, a consistently blue state. Actually, the only Republican who's still a senator in a consistently blue state. Moving on to Maine, the 2026 United States Senate election in Maine. The primary itself is very interesting. Two major players in the primary: incumbent Governor Janet Mills, who is no longer going to be running for governor. She's term limited, so she is running for U.S. Senate now. And Graham Plattner, who is the harbor master, the Sullivan harbor master. And Plattner's running as progressive. Mills is running as more of an establishment candidate. And others have withdrawn from the race, pretty much having it shaping up to be a one-on-one race. And you look at the aggregate polling, that's a long time to have a poll, July to December. Plattner's up 15% there. October to December, still a long time, but Mills is up by 4% there. And the average is Plattner up by 5.7. I'm sorry, that's aggregate polling over that time period. It's obviously that's a long time to do a poll. That's also a long time to do aggregate polling. But you look, and they've kind of traded back and forth. The reason for Plattner being up 15 on average is you look at this one from October here. Pan Atlantic Research, there's 845 likely voters. It shows Plattner up by 20. I don't know who wins the nomination here. I honestly can say, like, Plattner's had some scandals, but additionally, Mills is older, and I know Democratic primary voters have shown a tendency to generally favor younger candidates over the past year. So I honestly can't say who wins here. I personally think it's going to come down to name recognition as well as, see, and the thing with finances is Janet Mills hasn't filed an FEC report yet because she didn't declare until fourth quarter. So her fundraising numbers won't be public until sometime in January. So the biggest thing with that then is, I can't take fundraising into account, but Plattner has shown an ability to fundraise as well, which generally is the biggest issue for candidates on the more ideological islands of either party. For non-establishment candidates or first-time candidates, the biggest issue they encounter is fundraising, and Plattner has shown an ability to do that. So, I mean, that could show an ability to win the primary. Additionally, I bet his name recognition is pretty close to Janet Mills at this point. But then again, I cannot say for sure. But let's take a look at the Republican primary. Susan Collins has publicly expressed interest, but she has not declared as a candidate yet, which I'm very curious how that works, because I don't know how every state works, but the primary is soon. So I imagine she has to get paperwork in soon, but I don't know. But long story short, she'd far and away win the primary. And if we look at the general election polling, we look at Susan Collins versus Janet Mills, tied at 43%, Collins +4, Mills +5. But you look, in polling has steadily declined for Mills against Collins, whereas it has increased for Plattner against Collins. So, I mean, this election is really going to depend on the Democratic primary. And once again, in 2020, we saw that Democrats were polling ahead of Collins, and Collins ended up winning by 8 points in 2020. I would say if Plattner wins, this race is tilt Democratic. If Mills wins, this race is lean Republican. But I would say, I think, given Zohran Mamdani's victory in the Democratic primary in the New York mayoral election, which I know is different, it's a different electorate than you have in Maine, but also Maine's more of a working class state as far as the Northeast goes. I would say that Graham Plattner probably wins the primary and barely wins the general election against Susan Collins. So that being said, all things considered, in 2026, as of now, I believe that the Democrats flip the states of North Carolina and Maine and win 49 seats in the Senate, whereas the Republicans retain all of their other seats and have 51 seats in the Senate. Still a Senate majority, although 2 less seats than they currently have now. I want to thank you all for watching the video. Please remember to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Really helps me out. Make sure to turn on the notification bell as well once you subscribe, so you can get notified whenever I post one of these videos and stay up to date. And make sure to share the video with your friends as well. I hope this is a fun alternative way for you to get a deep dive into political news without hearing partisan politics or opinions other than mathematical and electoral opinions that actually give us insight into what outcomes might be. And just a disclaimer as well, these are my best guesses, and that's what they are. And no political pundit will tell you that, but that's what these are, is guesses. And I feel pretty confident in this, and I'm going to do this once a month. And if anything changes, obviously I'll change it month to month. So I want to thank you all for watching. Once again, please remember to subscribe, like the video, and hit the notification bell so you can get notified whenever you post. Thank you very much.